Okay, we have a lot to get to tonight, so let's get into it. I have an agenda. I haven't really agended much in previous streams, but I at least wrote down kind of what I want to get to tonight. It was pretty free flowing before, and let's be honest, I think it will be again tonight. But I want to talk through, as we often do, Jesse's questions. A couple of them stood out to me. Um, I want to talk about specifically, Jesse, your questions about the troll poem or relating to the troll poem, because it's one of my absolute favorites. So I want to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about Baron and Luthien, the Tale of Tinúviel, and so I guess it's going to be a poetry heavy class. Um, and then this stabbing of Frodo at Weathertop, and then we'll get into the flight to the Ford. Um, and that's where Glorfindel will come in. Which, now that I think about it, boy, Lola, if you need to bounce early, I know it's late there, but Glorfindel will be in the back half, I think. but feel free to bring him up tangentially if we touch on anything that bears on him later. So, Jesse asked, as always, great questions. So I want to talk about two in particular, like I said, that kind of bear on the troll poem. And so the first one was Jesse said, I don't want to be all negative, but does anyone else find reading all the poems and songs kind of exhausting? I was really glad Strider explained what it was all about after it, because when I was reading it, I had no idea what the heck was going on, referring to the Baron and Luthien poem. But I think, this is an attitude that I have always had about the poetry and the songs in Lord of the Rings until this, like 6 months ago, a year ago, something like that. And I just skipped them, to be honest. Like I just sort of, okay, verse now, let me get back to the prose so I can understand the story and what's going on. And so I get it. Like it's dense stuff, and I don't have the creative, artistic, sort of metrically inclined mind to appreciate poetry off the page and analyze it and understand it. But I have found so much value in listening to people who do know what they're talking about talk about the poetry in Tolkien and the songs. And it's just something that I needed opened up to me. So I don't know that I'm just going to parrot some of the things that I've heard and tell you the things that I love about it, in particular the troll poem. But I'm not the one to really elucidate why, Tolkien's poetry is excellent and high class, but it's worth digging into is all that I'll say. It's worth looking up the people who know. I've referenced before Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, and his podcast and his series Exploring the Lord of the Rings. It is fantastic. They go through in line by line, word by word, the entire book. So I've been listening to it for, I found it a year ago or more. I've caught up to them, and they are still doing the Council of Elrond. I think it will probably end up being at least a year of classes, one every week, doing the Council of Elrond, just analyzing it, probably more than a year, which, I mean, it's just great. Like, I feel like I understand everything that they've covered so far so well because of it. And in particular the poetry, because Professor Olson really understands the poetry and can really speak to it. But that's making, I think, the troll poem seem a little highbrow, and the reason why I like it is because it isn't. And what opened my eyes to how good the troll poem or the troll song is when it was revealed to me that it's a drinking song. It's a pub song. That's the entire reason for it. It's Sam making a song that he could sing at the Green Dragon, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had. And it's meant for audience participation. So I'll grab it and see. I'll talk about where we're getting way ahead into the Flight to the Ford chapter. and we will, of course, come back. But the lines, "for meat was hard to come by," and then "done by, gum by," those are audience participation lines. That's when the crowd, half drunk, would be shouting out rhymes for "come by." And so, "done by, gum by," even partial rhymes, or whatever else came into their head. And once I sort of envision it that way, it's so fun. And of course, in the context of like this really serious and deadly flight from Weathertop to the ford, and being pursued, and the gloom that they must be feeling, this sort of lifting of the spirits is exactly, I mean, what have we been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks, is spiritual battles and despair and hope, and how much must a good old-fashioned Hobbit drinking song, pub song, have lifted up the spirits of Frodo in this time? I mean, did Sam save his life with this song? I don't know that that's too much to say. So the other thing that Jesse asked, and this was such a good question. Let's see if I can pull it up. It was about Tom with his big boots on, and whether that has anything to do with Tom Bombadil. And that is such a good question, because it's kind of a generic name, but this is also something that I read or heard before. But why should, I mean, obviously Sam, when he made up the poem, had not met Tom Bombadil. He didn't know Tom Bombadil. So Sam wouldn't have had him within the frame of the story, wouldn't have had Tom Bombadil in mind when he came up with the name Tom. But we know that Tom has dealings with Farmer Maggot. Tom may or may not, I mean, he's ancient, he's eldest, that's what he is, so why shouldn't he have had dealings with other hobbits in the past? Why shouldn't the name Tom have become something of like a legendary character name in Hobbit poetry, right? Or Hobbit stories? I think that absolutely could be, right? We can't answer whether Tolkien was thinking about Tom Bombadil when he came up with this poem. I think chronologically, and someone may correct me on this, but I think that, well, I know that the troll poem was written way, way, way before The Lord of the Rings. This was inserted into The Lord of the Rings. This was an existing poem. And it went through a lot of revisions during Tolkien's life, and the names got changed. And at some point they were Jim and John instead of Tim and Tom. But I think by this point, by the time that he wrote even the Tom Bombadil poetry, which is also an insert into Lord of the Rings, I think he had already written this poem. But I think we could easily construct a, within the frame of the book, theory as to how the name Tom is so known in Hobbit lore that even without knowing Tom Bombadil himself, just like kind of like Jack and the Beanstalk, right? Jack the Giant Killer. That's kind of a big English trope, or was around that era. The name Jack. That's why C.S. Lewis decided he wanted to be known as a boy as Jack. And that name stuck with him his whole life. His name was Clive Staples, but he went by Jack Lewis his whole life because as a boy he wanted to be like Jack the Giant Killer. So why shouldn't little Hobbit children be raised on stories of Tom? And Jesse, that's another point. Isn't it possible that Sam had also just changed the name after meeting Tom? Certainly possible. Yep, could have done that. Now, Tom in the poem is a bit of a tragic figure, or he's kind of the if you'll pardon me, the butt of the joke, having kicked the butt of the troll and come up with his leg lasting lame, right? He kind of got his comeuppance. I don't know that that's something he would have pegged Tom Bombadil as the role for, having met him. That's the only piece that doesn't hang true. And yeah, Paige, I mean, Tom could just be a common name, and it could just be coincidence. That's absolutely true. It could just be two Toms, and that's just, it's just a name that fit the rhyme scheme, and also they met a Tom Bombadil. Perfectly plausible. Just not a very interesting story. So anyway, I wanted to get to that, and yeah, the troll poem, love it. Okay, so from poem to poem, and from goofy to deep, let's go to, where is it? Tale of Tinúviel. And so when I referenced this, I said this was kind of something that made worlds collide for Tolkien, and the reason I said that, and I'm familiar with the history of Middle Earth. I know the chronology roughly, but there are better scholars among us than me, so I'll be corrected if I'm wrong here. But coming back, remember, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit. It was hugely popular, hugely successful, and the publishers were clamoring for a sequel. But he had already written all these stories about the Elder Days, about Gondolin and Beren and Luthien and Turin Turambar, and he wanted to write the Silmarillion and give that to his publisher and have them publish that. And they said, no, this is awful. People want to read about hobbits, right? And in a way, they were right. People wanted to read about hobbits, but they were wrong about it being awful. Anyway, he had a whole world of the Elder Days and the elves and everything else in his head. The Hobbit had never been part of that. That was just a children's story. He recycled some of the names from his mythology, Elrond and whatnot, but in his head, they were never the same world. They were never the same story. And that continued into his starting to write Lord of the Rings. And when he got to this point in the story, when Strider said, I will tell you the tale of Tinúviel, that seems to be where he decided, no, actually, these are the same worlds. This is the same story. And then all the things that flow from that, the necromancer becoming Sauron the Maya, Morgoth being the Dark Lord who came from outside. What he had done was he had used his mythological world to give the illusion of depth to his Hobbit story and the sequel and whatnot. But it was never really part of that world. He just used the names and the concepts and theories, and that's why some of it doesn't really work perfectly. Like the Arkenstone in The Hobbit sounds a lot like a Silmaril, right? It's not a Silmaril, but he kind of used the Silmarils as a template for it, right? Even the Elven King's halls in The Hobbit, that's just kind of a watered down Doriath, right? It's not intended to be, he's just recycling concepts. But when he gets to, I will tell you the tale of Tinúviel, that's when he decides, nope, it's the same. It's all, to borrow Sam's phrase, we're in the same story still. I'm butchering the exact quote, but you get the point, right? So this is a story, this is a poem that he loved, and it went through a lot of iterations, like a lot of his poetry. Like Beren wasn't always a mortal man. He was an elf from a different kind of tribe. Anyway, initially. But he loved this story, and it was always something near and dear to him. And we talked about it on Discord in a way that Beren and Luthien are, representative of himself and his wife Edith. Many people know that Beren and Luthien are what is carved into his and his wife's tombstone. And the passage about Beren seeing Luthien dancing in the forest with feet as light as linden leaves, that is sort of inspired by, just a day when he was out in the woods with his wife Edith and she was dancing in the trees. So obviously this was something very near and dear to him, and he loved this story, and he wanted, backing up again to his publisher said, you'll never publish the Silmarillion. Well, he loved these tales, and if he's going to write a story about a Hobbit sequel, why not, if he's never going to be able to publish Beren and Luthien, why not insert it here? Kind of, backdoor the poem into popular culture. And I think that's interesting in and of itself. And then the poem is great. It's an enjoyable read. What I want to talk about is how different in The Lord of the Rings the poem is from the prose, which I think is really interesting, because it kind of tells two stories, right? The poem tells the first part of the story of Beren and Luthien, and then sort of touches on the second part, and then the prose kind of fills in the rest. And I think let's back up to just before he started telling the story, because I want to make another point. So I'm on page 249 of mine. As night fell and the light of the fire began to shine out brightly, he, Strider, began to tell them tales to keep their minds from fear. Okay, so night is falling. They're in the dell at Weathertop. They know or fear or guess that they may be attacked this night. And Strider has dealt with the riders before. He knows how they attack. We also know how they attack because we've read the attack on the House of Crickhollow. These are exactly sort of the same attack strategies. We can see everything the same. So when night falls and Strider starts telling his stories, he's doing this, I believe, because he knows that the fight has started. It is already on. He's telling them stories to keep their spirits up, and the sense of fear that had been growing on Fatty Bulger all day at Crickhollow is being directed at them right now in the Dell. I have little doubt that the Ringwraiths are all around them right now. They are in place. And so he tells them histories and legends of long ago. And I assume he's been telling them that for quite some time. He paused at the end of one story. Merry asked him to tell of Gil-galad. Frodo begins. Strider says, no, not that one. Basically, that tale should not be told now with the servants of the enemy at hand. He knows where they are. Then tell us some other tale of the old days, begged Sam. A tale about the elves before the fading time. I would dearly like to hear more about elves. The dark seems to press round so close. The dark is pressing round. We know why the dark is pressing round. And then this is what I kind of puzzle with, and I'd like your thoughts on this. He says, I will tell you the tale of Tinúviel. It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales of Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your hearts. My question is why? Why will the tale of Tinúviel lift up their hearts, though it is sad? So I'm going to talk about the tale a little bit, give a little Cole's Notes version and sort of a summary of both the poem and the prose. But while I do that, I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments about why this sad tale in particular may lift up their hearts at a time like this when that is exactly what they need, right? And just came to me now, Where am I to find courage? Frodo asked Gildor. In unlikely places, said Gildor. I wonder if that's what's going on here. He's finding courage and hope against despair in an unlikely place. A sad story. Maybe. We workshop that. But, so, the poem has, what do we have here? 9 stanzas. The first 8 are boy meets girl. Classic boy meets girl story. The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen, of stars in shadow shimmering. Tinúviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. And it goes on like this. The meeting of them, they don't actually meet until the 7th stanza. That's when he catches her. and doom fell on Tinúviel. So they fall in love. That's the first, majority of the poem. And then, long was the way that fate them bore o'er stony mountains cold and grey, through halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more, and long ago they passed away, in the forest singing sorrowless. So they met for 8 stanzas, and then in the 9th stanza, they did some stuff, and then they both died, and then they met again, and then they died again. That's a lot on one stanza. So then Strider goes into prose mode, okay? It tells of the meeting of Beren, son of Barahir, and Luthien Tinúviel. Beren was a mortal man, but Luthien was the daughter of Thingol, a king of elves upon Middle-earth when the world was young. So he briefly talks about their meeting, but then, in those days, the great enemy, of whom Sauron of Mordor was but a servant, and then he goes on to tell everything that Beren and Luthien did. So he expands this 9th stanza into prose, so they can they can understand it better. And so, what is the effect of obviously, so he that's not the entire tale of Tinúviel. It's a long tale of which the end is not known. And he doesn't tell them the entirety of it in poem form, but then he tells them the remainder in verse. What is the effect of him splitting the poem and the verse, or a poem and the verse and the prose, and why, and what bearing does that have on the sad tale lifting their spirits? I'll venture a guess, and then I want to read your comments, but there are possibilities, right? It's a sad but beautiful tale. That's one. It's just a beautiful story, and even though it's sad, it should lift your spirits because it's beautiful. That's possible, and I don't say that dismissively. It just feels like, shouldn't there be more to it than that? Maybe that's the entirety of it, but let's start with that, the obvious one. The second possibility is that the hobbits just aren't going to get it. This is a sad tale, yet it may lift up your hearts because you don't understand the full implications of it, right? If you've read the Beren and Luthien story, it's sad, but mostly for elves. And Strider does touch on that. I think they've lost those whom they most loved. That's largely why it's sad, right? So your hobbits, you don't know elves at all. You won't understand why this is a big deal. It's a sad story, yet it may lift your hearts because you're ignorant, is a harsh way of putting it, but I don't discount that. I think that's possible. 3, without getting spoilery, we will find that this tale has significance directly for Strider, right? This has bearing on his life. And so there is reason to think that it's a sad tale, but it lifts his heart. And so, hey, it may lift your heart. It certainly lifts mine, so I'm going to say it anyway, right? And then the last option that I can think of is that the poem won't lift up your hearts necessarily, but the prose will. Because in the prose, we talk about how, remember, Baron and Luthien got together and then did some stuff in the poem. Well, in the prose, we talk about them doing some stuff, right? And the stuff that they do is kind of throw down the great enemy of whom Sauron of Mordor was but a servant, right? So the good guys won. This is a feel-good story where much was lost, especially by the elves, but much was gained. That can be debated, but at least in the prose version that as he retells it, they won. They accomplished what they set out to do. And in the current circumstances, that would be an encouraging thing to Frodo and the others, right? Okay, let me get your thoughts. Okay, yeah. So Paige's thought was similar to mine. That the first thing I suggested. So in the end, it's the poem is a love story, and love is pretty powerful, right? So you're saying that more eloquently than I did. Strider may be trying to give them love and hope to cling to in the dark of night. Sure, love is beautiful, and you hobbits may be heartened by that because this is a beautiful love story. It's definitely possible. Jesse says maybe it's kind of like when you're sad and watching a sad movie somehow makes you feel better because you're not suffering alone. Misery loves company? Okay. So I'm in a dank, scary dell under Weathertop, but, the elves lost her whom they most loved, so, in every life a little rain must fall, right? Morgan got there before me. Yes, maybe Strider has someone on his mind during the poem. Yeah, maybe, it may lift up his heart to think of that, shouldn't it? Yeah, Aiden has a good one. Tinúviel is a being of light, and though the end is sad, the intent of her sacrifice is beautiful, and her lineage prevails. It's comforting to be reminded that others have faced similar perils. Yeah, and I think that especially comes through, like I said, in the prose version, right, that Aragorn tells, that others have faced similar perils. These two walked right into Angband. Like, that's unfathomable. I mean, I have to think that at least Frodo and Sam would know something of Morgoth, right? The great enemy. They would have heard Bilbo's tales, right? And I mean, if you've heard of Gil-galad, surely you've heard a little further back than that, right? Surely you have heard through Bilbo some stories. I would have to think so. So they would know the magnitude of that. Parmelk says it's a heartbreaking story, but overall hopeful. I think it speaks of hardship and loss, but also perseverance. Yes, and I think I'm coming around to thinking maybe it depends on whose point of view you're taking, right? The loss is largely from the elves, and the gain is largely to mortals, right? So to an all-mortal audience, maybe that's a particularly heartwarming story. He wouldn't tell this story to a group of elves looking to be cheered up. Yeah, Jesse says maybe that last reason is why he splits it between poem and prose. He wants to make sure they understand how it ended. Yeah. I have to think the hobbits are better at understanding poetry than we are today, especially these hobbits. So I would, I wonder about that. Would they have understood the section of the poem that talked about them going to Angband if he had said it in poetry? I would think they would have a chance. Maybe it's about the legacy, Lola says. Yeah, the legacy. What does Aragorn say about the legacy of Beren and Luthien? He does, that's what I thought. There live still those of whom Luthien was the foremother, and it is said that her line shall never fail. Elrond of Rivendell is of that kin, for of Beren and Luthien was born Dior, Thingol's heir. Dior, Thingol's heir, and of him Elwing, the White, whom Eärendil wedded, he that sailed his ship out of the mists of the world into the seas of heaven with a Silmaril upon his brow. And of Eärendil came the kings of Númenor, that is, Westerness. Right, and of Elwing and Eärendil, Elrond, right? So the legacy, as he tells it, is whose house we're going to. The reason why there is a safe haven for you and the ring right now, Frodo, somewhere at least to make for in the wilderness, is because of their success. That's a good point. I like that. And he doesn't talk about, well, we get a hint, I guess, right? He talks about the kings of Númenor. And as he was speaking, they watched his strange, eager face dimly lit in the red glow of the wood fire. His eyes shone, and his voice was rich and deep. Above him was a black, starry sky. There's some cues there, right? For those of us who know the rest of the story. There are some hints. Yeah, Christy says, also, it's elves, sir. And maybe the hobbits just like hearing any stories about them. Yes. And I think Sam asked specifically about the elves before the fading time, right? And it's interesting, though, that Strider chose this one, because it isn't really about the elves before the fading time. It's about one elf, certainly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good point, Christy. There's also a line from Strider about it's hard to render in common speech, so it could be that it's just easier to finish in prose rather than be translating the poem on the fly. Yes. So I agree with half of that. I think, and I have to think about this more if I fully agree, but I think more likely the poem has been translated into common speech and he's reciting it. But I think he's acknowledging that there are some limits to the translation. This is the best I can do. This is the best I can give you. This is the translation as I have it. So I would be surprised if he were coming up with perfectly symmetrical meter like this on the fly on a translation. Don't put it past him because he's pretty great, but I would guess that he's pointing out the limitations of it and saying, this is kind of the best I can render in your ears. Yeah. Okay, so so we talked about the fight, right? We began talking about this is the spiritual battle, right? So let's move on to the conclusion of that battle. All seemed quiet and still, but Frodo felt a cold dread creeping over his heart now that Strider was no longer speaking. That's the clearest possible cue that we're on the right track here, right? That he feels the cold dread oppressing him now that Strider is no longer speaking. The battle was on. Strider was doing well. He was shielding them, but there's a lull in the story, and now the attack is closing in. So Sam runs back from the edge of the dell. Strider yells, keep close to the fire with your faces outward. For a breathless time, they sat there, silent and alert, with their backs toward the wood fire, turned to the wood fire, each gazing into the shadows that encircled them. Nothing happened. There was no sound or movement in the night. This is Crickhull, right? This is exactly their move, their attack pattern from Crickhull. They have moved to their, to the sides of the house and to the door, and they stand there. What was the line? As still as the shadows of stones, or something like that. Great alliteration, but also just a great line, and that's how I think of them. I think they are at the lip of the dell now, standing there, oppressing them with terror, right? Making them, they assume, easy pickings, right? So then they come over the lip of the dell. What happens? Let's look at each of them, each member of the party. Terror overcame Pippin and Merry, and they threw themselves flat on the ground. Okay, so they just fail. No great judgment. This happens. They're kind of soft and doughy. They lost. There was a battle, and they lost. They fall down. They're out of it. It's happened. It's happened to better men than them. It's okay, but you lose. Sam shrank to Frodo's side. Okay, this isn't an F, but it's not action, it's not defiance, it's not keeping his spirits up, but he goes in the right direction towards Frodo. He's shrinking back, but he's still in the fight, okay? Frodo was hardly less terrified than his companions. He was quaking as if he was bitter cold, but his terror was swallowed up in a sudden temptation to put on the ring. The desire to do this laid hold of him, and he could think of nothing else. He did not forget the barrow, nor the message of Gandalf, but something seemed to be compelling him to disregard all warnings, and he longed to yield. Not with the hope of escape, or of doing anything, either good or bad, he simply felt that he must take the ring and put it on his finger. Okay, there was some, I think Jesse had a question in this direction, and there was some discussion in the chat, in the Discord about this, about whether, which direction is this working, right? Is this the ring tempting him to put it on? Is it the ring wraiths, the riders compelling him to? I think it's absolutely both, but this is compulsion from outside in a way that we haven't seen before. If we look back at all the other ring temptations, there has been rationalization. There's been sort of a monologue. There's been well, Gandalf's advice seemed absurd. He was still in the Shire, and I'd better hang on to the ring. I better hold the ring in my pocket so that it doesn't get away. And that's the check down position from, I should put the ring on and vanish out of this silly situation, right? This is none of those things. I mean, that temptation is there. The ring is working on him for sure. But overwhelming all of that is an unreasoned compulsion. I must, right? That has to be the rider. Why? Why is the rider compelling the ring to be put on? There are two sort of mundane and practical explanations, and a third more spiritual one, I think. One, they don't know, there are 3 hobbits there. They don't know which one has the ring. They have to find out which one, so sort of a generalized area command, put on the ring, is useful, practically. Also practical, they can't see very well, so if they want to grab or stab the ring bearer, it would be really helpful for him to be in the spirit world, partially, with the ring on, as we see him do, right? When he puts it on, their eyes fall on him, right? Oh, there it is. There's the ring bearer. There's the ring. It's him. They all rush. Well, they start to rush. We'll get to that. So it's really important that he put on the ring for those reasons. But it's also important because, again, spiritual battle. To make to make him obey their will is important, right? That puts him at a disadvantage in this spiritual battle. He is already in a position of having yielded, right? And they're using the temptation of the ring to put him in a disadvantageous position. They don't know which one, but whichever one puts the ring on, that's going to be him putting himself at a disadvantage relative to that, right? So, okay, but the battle isn't over. Frodo submits. He puts on the ring, right? But, so their eyes fall on him, pierce him, and they rush towards him. Desperate, he drew his own sword, and it seemed to him that it flickered red as if it was a firebrand. So he takes action. He doesn't just sit and cower. He's already put himself at a disadvantage by putting on the ring, but he starts to redeem himself, right? He takes action. He takes out his sword. He's defiant. He's holding himself in a position opposing them still. He's not yielding. Two of the figures halted. Okay, so we see something special about this sword, right? It flickers red like a firebrand. Oh, did the stream freeze? Looks like only for you, Castlesville. Yeah, okay, we're good. Two of the figures halted. Okay, one, he's opposing them. That's news, right? He should be terrified by now. He should be lying on the floor in a pool like jelly. That's what their whole aura has been about. Why are they still being opposed? This is scary. And I say that advisedly, scary to the riders. Two, he's got a fancy sword. It flickers red in his eyes in the spirit world. There's something fancy about this. I don't like that. So two of the figures halt. They fail their check. They stay at the lip, right? The leader advances, right? The third was taller than the others. His hair was long and gleaming, and on his helm was a crown. In one hand he held a long sword, and in the other a knife. Both the knife and the hand that held it glowed with a pale light. He sprang forward and bore down on Frodo. Okay, so the leader's still coming. At that moment, Frodo threw himself forward on the ground, and he heard himself crying aloud, "O Elbereth Gilthoniel." Another action, right? More opposition. He fights back. He throws himself forward on the ground. He's striking at the feet of his enemy, and he yells this out. He hears himself crying aloud, "O Elbereth Gilthoniel." So there are two things happening here. He's taking action, throwing himself forward, striking at the feet of his enemy, and something is happening. This invocation of Elbereth is being expelled from him. And I think back to Gildor's blessing, right? May Elbereth protect you. We talked about that at the time. That's a real thing. That's not just, Gesundheit, right? That's a real active blessing of Elbereth. Now, it's not something that he could just, use at will. Elbereth is obviously doing something here, right? He says that he strikes at the feet of his enemy, misses, as we'll find out, but a shrill cry rings out in the night from the rider, right? And the rider stabs at him and gets him, but then runs off, right? As we find, runs off. And that burst of O Elbereth Gilthoniel is obviously, and as Strider says, more deadly to him was the name of Elbereth. That's like I don't want to say force field or aura or something. It sounds like it cheapens it, but it protects him, right? The riders flee from this, right? So he has taken action, and Elbereth has clearly taken action. So I think that's how I read the attack at Weathertop. Paige asks, elves do seem to have some resistance to the riders, so something as simple as saying their names would throw off the riders. So I'm assuming you're thinking of Glorfindel riding them down, right? They withdrew and I pursued them, right? So one Glorfindel, one elf chased off 4 or 5 riders. I think he's special. I don't think. I mean, obviously, the elves in all the stories would certainly qualify as special too, but Glorfindel is a more powerful elf than they would normally have dealings with. Gildor is too. Gildor could probably mess them up, but could Legolas? No, they wouldn't withdraw in front of Legolas. I'm confident in that. Lois says her friend and her used to shout, "O Elbreth Gilthoniel," when she was excited or stressed. I'm going to start doing that. That's a good one. Okay, we are quite a while in and we haven't even started Flight to the Ford. So there are a few things I want to talk about there. Let's sort of continue on that thread though. Jesse asked a question, why don't they attack again? I think that they are rattled, the riders, and scattered. This attack at Weathertop sort of comes off as a disaster for Frodo and his party, but it was a disaster for the riders too. They were opposed effectively, and that is not something that I think they would be used to. They were attacked back. They had the name of Elbreth thrown at them in power and effectively. I think that they are rattled. I think they probably got scattered leaderless at Weathertop. I think they probably practically took some time to find each other and then probably decided, what are we going to do? We can't attack them again. Not until all 9 of us are here. And we know that 4 of them have been sent off we will find that 4 of them have been sent off on another errand. So 5 wasn't enough. We're not powerful enough to take that group of 5 mano a mano. Okay, well, we've stabbed him. That's, we'll find that's a thing, right? So I think this is more a tap and trace, right? They are going to hold the fort against this party, but otherwise let the wound do its work. I think they attack again because they think they can't. It's probably a miscalculation. They're weaker now. Their morale is down, but I think that I don't think this is strategy entirely. I think this is they can't or won't. Yeah, Blake says the riders are having a tough time. They're used to fighting the armies of men, not a scraggly band of hobbits, right? They've had it easy for so long. Yes, well, my calculations were bad. So good. Well, hang on a second. So Lola says it's a group of 3, actually. 1 plus 4 times 0.05. Or, sorry, 0.5. Yeah, 4 halflings. Yeah. But doesn't Sam count for 6 by himself? I don't know. He might. Okay. So, in the Flight to the Fort. Okay. All right, here it is. Glorfindel. Let's read his introduction because I want to talk about that briefly. We'll go past the troll poem. Suddenly into view, I'm on page 273 of my version. Suddenly into view below came a white horse gleaming in the shadows, running swiftly. In the dusk, its headstall flickered and flashed, as if it were studded with gems like living stars. Those are probably gems from the shores of Valinor, eh? Isn't that kind of cool? the beaches there. Anyway, the rider's cloak streamed behind him, and his hood was thrown back. His golden hair flowed shimmering in the wind of his speed. To Frodo it appeared that a white light was shining through the form and raiment of the rider, as if through a thin veil. So we get some indication here, obviously to Frodo's eyes, and the implication is not to any of the other party members, that in the spirit world that Frodo is kind of half occupying now, Glorfindel is different, right? And we know that he is. So that's our first indication that he is something special. The other is the horse, which is, described at length and beautiful. I also love, in the paragraph before that, Strider was now leaning forward, stooped to the ground, with a hand to his ear and a look of joy on his face. We don't get a lot of joy from Strider to this point, right? Like, he's a very grim figure. That always makes my heart glad, that's, Strider's got to be pretty worn down at this point. He knows the sound of, at minimum, he knows the sound of an elf horse when he hears one. He might know the sound of Asphaloth. But he knows this is friend, right? And the joy, and I can't imagine the relief, right? That must feel so good. Aina vedui Dunedain, my Gavanen, hail at last to Dunedain, well met. Those are the first words from Glorfindel. But there seemed to be a note of haste or fear in his call, and they saw he was now speaking quickly and urgently to Strider. Okay, so Glorfindel puts Frodo on his horse, right? Against Frodo's argument, but he's eventually convinced. And then they get to the river, and I want to. We're running late, so I want to get to the river because I want to talk about some stuff there. Where are we going here? So, page 278 in my version. Glorfindel springs forward with a loud cry. "Fly!" he called. "Fly! The enemy is upon us!" Asphaloth leaps forward. Glorfindel cries out to Frodo, "Ride forward, ride!" He did not obey at once, for a strange reluctance seized him. Checking the horse to a walk, he turned and looked back. The riders seemed to sit upon their great steeds like threatening statues upon a hill, dark and solid, while all the woods and land about them were seated as if into a mist. Suddenly he knew in his heart that they were silently commanding him to wait. Then at once fear and hatred awoke in him. His hand left the bridle and gripped the hilt of his sword, and with a red flash he drew it. So this is interesting because this is Frodo opposing them, right? And that's good. He understands that they're commanding him, and he's fighting back, which in a way is good. I don't want to go back against what I've been saying about that being the right play, but this isn't the right play here, right? He needs to ride. He shouldn't be doing this. He shouldn't be stopping. He shouldn't be raising his sword. He should be riding. That's what he was told to do. And I think the cue that we get here, that this is the wrong play, is fear and hatred awoke in him. Hatred, fear is one thing, and this is an action driven by fear, so that's not good. But hatred, that's never good. That's not a good thing that a good character being driven by good motivations should be feeling. We know that to be true. So the fact that he's not driven by confidence or defiance or love, he's driven by fear and hatred to do this. And while it's a good action, or he intends it to be a good action, defying them, this is not the right play. He should be riding. He should not be checking Asphaloth to a walk, right? Yes, exactly, Aiden. Hate is a strong but deceptive motivator. Very good. Yeah, well said. So again, he gets to the ford, cries for them to go back, and he's almost overcome. The leader puts forth his power, Frodo feels his tongue cleave to his mouth, his heart labors, his sword breaks and falls out of his hand. And then the flood comes, right? And so this goes to, and this will be the last question of Jesse's I wanted to get to, but there are a lot of good ones here. Question 10: Why did the six stay on the shore? How did they get into the flood if only 6 of them stayed on the shore and only 3 went into the river and got washed away in the first knock of the flood, right? So this is also the other thing I wanted to say about Glorfindel, and Lola, you'll have to weigh in here. Did Glorfindel, because we see him, well, I'll read that passage where we see him running up, but did Glorfindel intend to kill the horses? That doesn't seem like a very elf-like thing to do. Was that the plan? Was that the game plan? Because that's the effect. He runs up behind them, they're startled, they jump into the water that bears all the riders away, right? With his last failing senses, Frodo heard cries, and it seemed to him that he saw, beyond the riders that hesitated on the shore, a shining figure of white light, which is Glorfindel, and behind it ran small shadowy forms waving flames, and that flared red in the grey mist that was falling over the world. The black horses were filled with madness, and leaping forward in terror, they bore their riders into the rushing flood. Okay. So I lift a lot from what I learn, as I said, from Corey Olsen's podcast. His conclusion on here I disagree with. It was suggested to him that, ultra spoilers ahead to the end of the book, where Sauron is defeated and from all his policies and webs, the minds of all of his servants are shaken free and they're bereft of leadership because he's no longer focusing on them and dominating them. And what is suggested on Professor Olsen's podcast was suggested to him that he liked was that the riders are dominating these horses, right? They're dominating the will of these horses. And when Glorfindel comes running up and there's a flood ahead of them, they lose that connection to that dominating connection over their horses, and the horses spook, right? They're not being told what to do anymore. They snap out of it. They're clear-headed. Oh, and now there's a river and whatever, and in they jump. And so Glorfindel wasn't intending to terrify them. He was just coming to get the riders, and this happened. And I just can't buy that. It just doesn't work for me as a reading. I just don't think that elves are that squeamish. Elves love nature. Elves live in harmony with animals and whatnot. But they also hunt. They cut down trees for wood. They're not vegan hermits, and I feel like sometimes they're cast that way. And no, I don't think that an elf lord in his wrath would have second thoughts about the death of a war horse, right? It's not the ends justify the means. It's just the nature of war, right? And I don't think, orcs orcs are servants of the enemy too, right? They're just enslaved servants of the enemy. By the logic of, an elf wouldn't kill a horse intentionally, would one kill an orc intentionally? They're dominated servants, right? Maybe they have a bit more free will than a horse, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think does it feel wrong to you that Glorfindel would choose to terrify the horses into leaping into the river? Does that viscerally feel wrong? Because it doesn't to me. Maybe I'm just a bad person, but that feels like war. And Glorfindel's seen his share of war. Yeah, that's and Parmark, that's another good point. The logic makes sense, but I don't see why a spooked horse would run towards that sort of danger of a flood. I don't know horses that well. I know them a little, but not that well. I don't think horses, when spooked like this, caught between two terrifying things, behave incredibly logically. Maybe they saw a ford, they know that there is, in theory, a way through to the other side, or there was a minute ago, and so they try to get that way, but there's a flood. I don't. Do we have any horse people here who would really know? Um, yeah, Christy says, we've been told there are all sorts of creatures that work for the enemy, so evil horses are entirely plausible to me. Yeah, right? Like, if we're going to ascribe the capacity for rational thought to Old Man Willow and to the spies, the birds and the beasts and the spies of the enemy, why would we deny that to the horses? That's kind of where I come down on it. Yeah, Lola says those horses were born and raised in Mordor. I'm afraid they were corrupted like their riders. And corrupted, I think, is the word. Although, I mean, they might not have been born and raised. We know that the horses are stolen from Rohan, the black horses of Mordor. Are they stolen from Rohan to be used, or stolen from Rohan to breed, and then those foals are raised and used? Probably the latter. So you're probably right, born and raised, but maybe just captured and broken. Yeah, so not to mention poor Balrogs. I mean, yeah, who sheds a tear for the Balrogs, right? Okay, yeah, so I'm not seeing a lot of disagreement. Yeah, I don't have a lot of cognitive dissonance over Glorfindel driving the horses into the river. That just doesn't bother me. Okay, let me steel man the counter argument if I can. If the horses are less morally culpable than their riders, which I think is a logical conclusion, in theory, they could be rehabilitated, maybe. And the ends justify the means is not an argument that we see successful, good characters in Tolkien make, right? So if the horses are redeemable, or if they are not morally culpable for their actions, then intentionally driving them into the river to their death, even to bring about the destruction or the temporary inconveniencing of the riders, is not a morally justifiable action. That would be steel manning the counter argument. I don't really buy it, but if we start from the premise that the horses are not to blame in this, they're just being dominated, they've been corrupted, but they don't have will in the matter, which I think you can make the case of that. That's not the most outlandish thing. Then you should not do evil that good may come of it. Tolkien was a devoted Roman Catholic. He would well know that principle and would believe it. And we see in his writings that is borne out, right? You cannot do evil that good may come of it. But I still come down on the side of that's not doing evil. This is a just war, right? Parmelk says he was feeling more distracted by feeling sorry for the horses because that's a horrible way to go. If you're squeamish, do your muffs for a second, but I can't imagine that it took them very long to go. A horse would break his neck in a second. in a flood like that, so they didn't suffer. Don't worry. Okay, earmuffs off. Yeah, and Wilms McD says death by river is probably a better fate than they would have gotten at the hands of their masters. You could make the case that they're better off now. Yes, that's absolutely true. Let me think that one through. Well, following this, we would have to also feel bad for soldiers of fortune that worked and fought for Mordor because they were just doing their job. I don't know if I'd go that far. They're making a choice to sell their swords to Mordor, right? If these horses were bred in captivity, I mean, what options do they have? I would call them less morally culpable, even if they are still morally culpable. Daria says, it is said somewhere that horses are not spirits too. Is it? Or are you thinking of when Gandalf says that they are real horses? That's why they could see them? Is that the passage you're thinking of? That's an interesting thought, Christy. Following that argument, say the horses suddenly come to and realize they've been used for evil. Could they not have thrown themselves in the water as in penance? Maybe. Or maybe they realize, hey, this guy on my back is evil. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to jump into the water and kill him. Sure, it's going to take me with him, but I have some atonement to do for what I've done. So, yeah, I'm going to kill this guy. Now, it didn't work out, but how smart is a horse? Maybe you didn't know. Yeah. So Parmalak is still asking about how an equestrian master would have to answer that. Someone who knows how horses behave in a panic situation. My guess is they're just panicking. Yeah. And they just sort of jump in a direction away from the last scary thing they saw, which would be Glorfindel. Well, we found the passage. Okay, because these horses are born and bred to the service of the Dark Lord in Mordor. Okay, thank you for confirming that. You're right. So they steal horses from Rohan to use as breeding stock to make horses to breed to the service of Mordor. That makes more sense, right? That makes sense, because I don't think the stolen horses would be good servants of the enemy. Yeah. Christy says, not a horse person, but it would really depend on the training of the horse. And okay, so how do the riders train these horses? I would think not in here's a carrot, you're a good horsey sort of way where they would develop a lot of trust between rider and horse. They probably just whip them until they do what they want, right? Like, it's probably not very effective, but I'm sure they do put forward a good amount of their will to dominate them, right? So maybe Professor Olson's explanation fits to a degree, right? Yeah. Okay, well, that's all I had for tonight, and we've gone a little long anyway, but that was a lot of fun. Yeah. Well, we didn't do nearly enough Glorfindel talk. I mean, he only appears briefly in the book and not at all in any of the movies, but he deserves better. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna bounce. Thank you, everyone. That was really fun, and we'll talk more on Discord. And we'll, yes, there's never enough Glorfindel talk, but thank you very much for coming. I will keep this posted, and we'll talk to you on Sunday. We're just going to do many meetings. I feel like we've been really biting off more than we can chew here. So many meetings, I think, is one we could do 1.5 chapters of, but I'm not splitting up the Council of Elrond. We may need to do 2 weeks on the Council of Elrond, but just many meetings for next week. So, talk to you later.